Welcome to Conversations in Tinnitus, a video podcast of the American Tinnitus Association. The American Tinnitus Association is a public charity under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code, a charity dedicated to research, advocacy, education, and support for people living with tinnitus, including their families. Conversations in Tinnitus video podcasts reflect our mission to amplify the patient voice, showcase evidence-based and promising emerging treatments, and highlight cutting-edge research. All of this is made possible through your generous support. Thank you. And we are recording. Okay, welcome everyone. Tinnitus Awareness Week 2025 is a really exciting point of time for everyone who's a stakeholder in the world with tinnitus, particularly the American Tinnitus Association. And today we're blessed and honored to have joining us Professor Mark Fagelson out of East Tennessee State University. He is a thought leader in the field of tinnitus, but he's also a very important stakeholder to the world of the ATA. He currently serves as the chair of our scientific advisory committee, which is a fancy way of saying he helps us identify which groundbreaking grants we'd like to fund in any given year. And so thanks to Mark's time and expertise in the field, he helps the ATA really set its vision for funding of research in a given year. And so without further ado, I'm going to invite Mark onto stage. And we're going to have a really exciting conversation today just about the ATA research and our scientific advisory committee. And he can speak in great detail about the science behind what it is that the ATA does and our mission. Ultimately, the ATA exists to silence tinnitus. We do this through groundbreaking research, programs for patients and families, and educational resources for professionals. Mark is a significant piece of that first part, the research. And so without further ado, Mark, welcome to the conversation. Thanks for joining us here today. And as always, thank you for all your service to the ATA.
Thank you, Patrick. Appreciate the opportunity.
Well, this is a fairly new format for us. So what I thought is if we just had basically a fairly informal conversation between you and I, but basically talking a little bit about like we were just saying, the research behind the ATA. If our mission is silencing tinnitus, the ATA's mission is silencing tinnitus, research is at the forefront of that. And so we identified fairly early on that something that we call the Scientific Advisory Committee was a crucial part of funding research. I'm curious, in your role as the Scientific Advisory Committee chair, could you speak about, not only what we call the SAC, the Scientific Advisory Committee, not only what it is, but why is it important, and what is your role on the SAC?
Sure, thanks. So right now I'm serving as the chair of the SAC, which is a great honor. I was a member of the Scientific Advisory Committee for the ATA for several years before I got nominated to take on the chair's position, and I always found it to be interesting work. It kept me kind of abreast of what was happening with respect to investigators in the U.S. and around the world, in the sense that they were offering studies that were, in some cases, basic science, bench science, in other cases, more clinically directed studies. And so working with the SAC over the years, I got a very nice kind of overview of what people were doing all around the world with respect to initiating studies. For the most part, the SAC provides early development funding for studies, sort of like seed funding. Now, this is particularly true for new investigators. And in this most recent round, we funded 2 studies from new investigators, one of which is a study that I think you'll be talking to the primary investigator, the principal investigator for later on, Robin Guillard. That's a sleep study. And then there's also a new investigator looking at developing an intake form that would have relevance for primary care physicians and interprofessional groups working with patients bothered by tinnitus. There are already some intake form surveys out there, but this one would use what's known as a Delphi method for developing the kinds of questions that would be asked. So the investigator is going to talk to a few dozen individuals who are very active working with patients to get their views on what primary care physicians and other professionals need to ask our patients in order to make sure they get triaged effectively and get directed to, kind of onward referrals in the most appropriate and reasonable manner. So those would be examples of really early type funding opportunities for individuals. And of course, that's crucial for new faculty members who may not be competitive for larger grants from, say, the NIDCD or from other large, funding agencies like the National Science Foundation, et cetera.
So, in my role as the CEO for the ATA, I've been on board now for about 6 months. I've seen and had some really fascinating conversations in the world of research, and there seems to be no shortage of need in terms of areas that need focus, whether it's triaging a patient or defining the word tinnitus or discovering things like biomarkers. Um, when we're talking about the scientific advisory committee itself, why does that matter? Why would a nonprofit like the ATA need a scientific advisory committee in the first place?
Well, I don't know that all charitable organizations need one, but certainly the ATA does, because we still have so much to learn about tinnitus, as you suggested, and not just about the mechanisms of tinnitus, but diagnostic instruments, intervention opportunities, um, ways to prevent it. And if we sort of look at the Scientific Advisory Committee in the context of the ATA's roadmap to a cure, or for a cure, we see that the researchers that are submitting grants to us are very mindful of the needs as the ATA has defined them moving forward. No one grant is going to address all these very distinct areas: diagnosis, intervention, prevention, right? However, by chipping away at different elements of the mission, at different elements of the roadmap, what we try to get is a more sort of multi, and I don't, the last tinnitus research initiative meeting, there was a presentation on the war against tinnitus. So I kind of hesitate to talk about advancing across several fronts. I just don't like that image. But we really were fortunate, especially in this most recent round of grant funding, to have a kind of a smorgasbord, might not be the best word, but to have a studies that addressed all these different elements. So we've got some studies that are addressing biomarkers, as you just suggested, with implications for both elucidating mechanisms and being able to validate interventions. We've got other studies looking at the intake of the patients and where they need to go. I kind of mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. We've got others that are looking at differences between sort of different types of patients in order to be able to determine whether there are therapeutic avenues that way as well. And so two of them that I'd like to just, and again, I don't want to get away from what the SAC is. Let me first back up just a minute, because really what you're asking about is, what is the SAC? So historically, there were I'm going to say about a dozen reviewers. This is when I was a member of the SAC, serving as one of the reviewers. And we would get, somewhere between maybe half a dozen, maybe up to 10 grants in a cycle per year to review. One of the things that we did last year was we had to reconstitute the reviewer pool for the SAC. And I cast a very wide net when I did that, right? I know a few people, but I know of a lot more people than I actually know. And this work gave me a good excuse to reach out to people, try to recruit them, tell them a little bit about the ATA, and gauge their interest in working with us. And I was heartened. I was blown away at the response. So we now have 28 reviewers. We essentially have our own Hall of Fame, if I can use a sports analogy, because most of these folks have been at it for quite a while. And indeed, some of the people that we brought in as reviewers have received funding from the ATA in the past, and actually were even applying in this round.
Mm.
So they're really practicing either clinically or in the lab at the top of the field, at the top of the profession. So working with these folks is a real honor and a real privilege.
And is that
And
something that provides an objective measure with which some of these grant applications are assessed? So, you know, you mentioned the 28 Hall of Famers basically that are serving on this committee that you're the chair of. And again, thank you for all your work. So if
and
we've got 20,
ironically, I'm not one of the Hall of Famers,
you're not one of them.
but please continue.
You're the servant leader of the Hall of Fame. I love that.
Yeah, I do. I sweep up and clean the ashtrays. Sure.
All right, that
Mhm.
I know the feeling. So you're sweeping up from these Hall of Famers here, they're providing the ATA with an arguably objective metric by which to evaluate any applications we receive through a given year. So I think it might help for me to just quickly touch base. Every year the ATA will open up applications for grant recipients. Um, and in that given year, once the applicants are received, or the applications are received, you and the SAC, the Scientific Advisory Committee, will take a look at each applicant and determine the validity, the scientific necessity of the given application, and then either recommend or not recommend moving forward with a particular application.
Correct. And one of the real strong points about having such a large pool of researchers serving on the SAC is that we can really kind of make sure that when a grant proposal comes in, it gets routed to somebody who really knows that work, somebody who's been in that area. And the argument could be made, well, okay, the politics are going to be this or that. And that's, when you talk about objectivity, that's always going to be a barrier to have to overcome. But we're really talking about good scientists here, and we're talking about people who want good science specifically in this area. So we feel very confident when we get a grant that we're going to be able to pick from our stable of SAC members 2, 3, 4, 5 potential reviewers who have some experience in that area, who have written maybe even grants in that area, who are familiar with the technology that's going to be used. They're familiar with the statistics that are going to be used. Of course, this becomes a bigger deal as time goes on. We've got a machine learning study, so we had to go out and find some reviewers who are capable reviewers of grants that are going to employ this sort of cutting edge, high volume math type analysis, right? Like genetic type work. So we're very, very fortunate, again, that we had buy-in from so many qualified individuals. And like I said, we've got 28 of them. The other thing I think I mentioned is that in the past, we've had, on the order of somewhere between maybe 6 to 12 grants in any one cycle. This last cycle, we had 25. And I'll just be honest, that was more than I thought we were going to see. And it really, I think it spoke to a couple things. Number one, it spoke to the reputation that the ATA has, and that is, I think, growing in the hearing science area as a source for funding and as a source for sort of high quality expert type information, both for scholars and for consumers, for all stakeholders. But I think that's the good news. The bad news is I think it also speaks to or spoke to the dearth of funding opportunities that are available in this crucial area. I think we would all agree that as time goes on, tinnitus is not going anywhere. It's not going away. And there are increasing challenges, I think, that are placed on individuals when the stressors of life, of day-to-day life, also seem to be increasing as time goes on. Now, we understand that patients who have anxiety or depression, or who are under a lot of stress tend to be more susceptible to tinnitus being more intrusive than individuals who are not in those kinds of situations. And I think many of us would agree that as time goes on, more of us find ourselves in those kinds of stressful situations for whatever
Yeah.
reason, right? So, and we also at the same time we want to be mindful of specific populations that are more prone to or are at risk for developing more severe tinnitus. Musicians, music exposed individuals, law enforcement, firefighters, veterans. And so another thing that I see the SAC being committed to as time goes on is working to identify these subpopulations of patients for whom specific interventions may be more amenable than they would be to other groups. And this is one of the reasons why I think Dr. Guillard's study is very interesting. He's looking at individuals whose tinnitus is affected by sleep. And what if what if we learn something from his brainwave recordings of individuals sleeping? What if we learn something about diagnosing tinnitus and intervening with tinnitus
Mm.
in a way that sort of everybody has access to, right? So that kind of work I think holds great promise, and nobody else is funding it right now except for us. And
You touched on two really things that I don't want us to miss. The first thing I just heard you say was there's no shortage of need in terms of the areas that need focus, right?
I
So one
would
of the
agree with that. Yeah,
okay, um, the AT, I mean that's a unique service that organizations like the ATA can strive to continue to provide, right? Like
right,
focusing on all of the areas, but areas where there may not necessarily be a lot of focus. And so our shortage from the ATA standpoint is we cannot give what we do not have. And so, uh, under my, since I've joined the organization, what we've tried to do is attach that need to any conversation we're having, because the more we have as a charitable organization, the more research we can fund, and then.
right,
Your role on the SAC and the importance of the SAC, which we've been talking about for the last 15 minutes or so, really helps us to identify here's some really interesting areas with these Hall of Famers.
right.
Here's some areas in research that we need to pay attention to, and here's an amount we think we can fund. Which reminded me of the second thing, which is there's all different types of research that can be funded, right?
Mhm.
And one could argue the quote unquote meaningful research. Well, I don't want to say anything too controversial here. I've heard people say that uh, people should be funding million and multi-million dollar research grants. Who cares about a 20 or a 30 or a $50,000 grant, which we
Right,
call our seed grant funding.
right, right.
Maybe you could speak a little bit about why even seed grant funding at this point is an important thing and why the SAC focuses on those areas.
Sure. It is crucial, especially for young faculty, for new investigators. And our current uh, uh, head of the board, Jinxing Zhang, tells a great story about how the ATA was the first organization to fund his research at a level that allowed him to really do some meaningful work. It launched his career. And this is one reason why he wanted to stay involved with the ATA. So I look at the seed funding. I think a lot of people look at it this way as it's always an investment. But here we're not just investing in the grant, we're investigating in the grantee. We're investigating in this researcher at the start of their career. And the more people we can get involved in tinnitus research early in their careers, the better, because the likelihood that they're going to stay there or at least come back after they've learned more stuff about hearing, et cetera, the better. And this is also one reason why we're funding travel grants for student groups and other new scholars. This is going to sound kind of crass, but really it's a matter of roping people in early. New faculty are extremely vulnerable. You've got to build it all yourself. Unless you go into a place where you are really signed on with a specific mentor and the infrastructure is there for scholarship. I can tell you from personal experience, being a new faculty member at an institution, I don't care which one it is, it's a real challenge. And those first few things that you try to do, those first few grants you try to write, those first few studies you try to accomplish, the saying is they come out of your hide. And it's true. It's a really challenging situation to be in. You're teaching a bunch of stuff you never taught before. Maybe you've got all these committees you're on. There's all this stuff to do. And you've got a dean of your college or a chair or your boss saying, where's that grant that you said you were going to be working on? And so the seed funding, not only does it give somebody to show, well, this is the work I've been doing, it also is essential for getting larger grants down the road. And not necessarily larger grants from ATA, larger grants from higher profile, better endowed grant agencies. So the key, I think the key here is we want to make sure that new investigators understand that this is a viable path for their scholarship. And I would even argue it kind of works on two levels. There's the researcher level, where we've got individuals needing to get studies going and needing to stake out a kind of a new area for themselves. Well, my gosh, the tinnitus area is still like the Wild West in a lot of ways. We still have so much to learn. We still have so many different things to try out. So that's one way in which the need is great. And again, like I said earlier, there are not a lot of agencies out there right now doing this kind of funding. So I see the sort of the bench science folks having an opportunity to get in, but I also see, and this is where our smaller, newer investigator grants I think would fall. They also support translational research. So we're also talking about not just doing some really intense bench science that is where you're going to maybe learn something about mechanisms, but the applicability in everyday clinical practice may not be obvious, versus this kind of stuff that we seem to be attracting, which would be studies that are not only investigating kind of a new angle on things, but that have some more direct, perhaps more immediate clinical applications. And one of the things that I think I bring to the SAC is that I'm still a clinician, right? I'm still seeing patients 3 days a week, 3 afternoons a week. And there's no substitute for that, in my opinion. Arguably one of the great tinnitus scholars of all time, Jack Vernon, was sort of famous, among other things, for saying that about 90% of what he knew about tinnitus, he learned from patients. So those of us that are still working with patients routinely, we're learning new stuff from them all the time. Now, it may not be practicable in the lab. It may, you may not be able to write a study about it, but it helps with the uptake of the information that the researchers are providing. And when I say uptake, I mean clinical uptake, right? And the more informed the clinicians are, the more likely the research will have value. And I'm also pleased to say that if I had to estimate it, I'd say about at least half the members of the SAC currently are routinely seeing patients also. At least
That's a stat that is really fascinating and speaks to that quote. And Jack Vernon, of course, our founder, the founder of the ATA. Um, Building on that idea, the importance of even having a clinical practice and seeing, being on the front lines, so to speak. Do you think that could help inform sort of the second half of this question, which is where are substantial breakthroughs still needed? I mean,
right.
if there's no dearth of need, where
Yeah.
would you say from your seat are the substantial breakthroughs that we need?
Well, this is a tough question because it really depends on who you ask. So if you ask a patient who's really bothered by tinnitus, they're going to say the most substantial need is you need a cure. You need something that shuts tinnitus off. I'm not going to disagree with that at all. But I will question the practicality and the feasibility of that in any sort of short-term way. So rather than saying, let's cure tinnitus, one of the things that I think we can also be asking is, how can we better identify specific patient groups whose specific form or forms of tinnitus may be most amenable to a specific intervention? Now, what we're doing is we're talking about tailoring interventions for specific patients or patient groups. And I think in that regard, we cannot learn enough, right? It's kind of a sort of obvious in a way, but it's driven by the observation that tinnitus is an extremely heterogeneous experience for its owner. You've seen one tinnitus patient, you've
Mm.
seen one tinnitus patient. I think I feel pretty confident saying that. Not everybody needs the same things. Not everybody has the same issues. Not everybody experiences the same thing. Not everybody's tinnitus started under the same circumstances. All these differences can be investigated. And all of these differences can lead to interventions that have potential to silence the tinnitus or at least reduce it,
Mm.
but not for everybody, just for a few people. But I think that's reasonable. Uh, I mean, if we can do that, if we can chip away at that 100 people at a time, it'll take a while, but man, after a while, we'll have made a dent, right?
Yeah.
And of course, the more we identify, and this is something I've learned from my work with veterans who have trauma experiences, the more you kind of identify these things that make people different, you actually also find a bunch of ways that they're the same. You also find a bunch of ways that you can actually maybe not cure something, but really go some distance toward addressing the concerns that that patient has. And now you're talking about perhaps a broader spectrum of the population, but you don't really know till you get in there and start looking at some of those inter-individual and intergroup differences. That's something that I know members of the SAC feel strongly about. This is something we've talked about kind of in some of the meetings that we've had. We've really haven't really seen a lot of studies come through targeting those subgroups, but I think that's something we're going to see more of. Will Sedley has a grant that we funded looking at differences or looking at the specific case of acute onset acute tinnitus
Mm-hmm.
that the person has had for just 2 months or less versus chronic tinnitus, with the idea being we do a pretty good job managing acute pain. Certainly, we do a better job with acute pain than we do with chronic pain. And maybe tinnitus will behave similarly. So he's looking at differences between chronic and acute tinnitus, specifically with the idea of coming up with ways to manage, and he's got a little treatment regimen, ways to manage tinnitus when it's still kind of brand new for that person. And it would be very, very satisfying, I think, for everybody if it turns out that if you get to it early, maybe you spare that person a lot of grief later on. We don't really know that yet.
Well, you're touching on my last and final question for this conversation, and what I can do is I'm going to share a quick slide here if this works on the grants the ATA funded this year that you were involved with the SAC with the analysis of these grants, these 5 recipients. Let me see if I can share it. It might help guide our conversation. If I hit the present thing and I share screen and I pick this window, I should be able to, there we go.
Ah, there they are. Yeah,
There
very
they
good.
are. So
Yeah,
let me hide the question slide here. So the ATA funded just under $500,000 in grant funding this year. And I think you were just referring to William Sedley's
right,
grant
right.
here early. So maybe you could give us a walkthrough here a little bit on some of the grants that we funded this year and why they might stand out to you
Sure.
or to the ATA.
So first, let me say, and you may recall this from when the board met to discuss these grants, the first thing I did was ask for more dough. The first thing I did was ask for more money. And that speaks to your kind of one of your initial statements. We can't we can't fund if we don't have the resources, right?
Yeah.
So you look at the first three grants listed here, Sedley, Lopez Escamez, and Sidoroff. They're all 2-year grants, right? And so what I wanted to do was to try to convince the board to let us do these, to let us do this round of funding and then actually be able to add more, even though a couple of these grants are pretty big and going for 2 years, right? So again, just to kind of highlight the need and the value to the ATA of support for the SAC and support for this grant process. There were, as I said, 25 grants that we received. That means that there were 20 that we didn't fund. At least half of them, honestly, in my experience, would have been fundable in prior years. The reason they were not fundable this year was because the competition was so stiff. That's a good news. That's a good news and bad news situation, right? The good news is, yeah, people are interested in applying for funding through the ATA. And some of the best labs on the planet are doing so. That's the good news. The bad news is we can't help them all. So real quickly, just to go through some of these, Dr. Sedley's work, again, is taking a look at individuals with acute tinnitus and doing some electrical stimulation and also some sound therapy to be able to determine how effective those strategies are for individuals whose tinnitus is not yet chronic. The next one is that one of the machine learning studies that I mentioned. So there are going to be, there's a large database, the Unity database from overseas, that will be analyzed with respect to a variety of different genetic variables, and of course tinnitus, to determine whether there are any patterns that could be investigated more fully later on. And again, and these investigators also were going to be using their machine learning protocol to determine the strength of any associations between tinnitus and tests of cognitive ability, as a way to kind of address this kind of emerging concern that tinnitus and dementia may be related to one another. So they're going to be looking at that as well. The Sidoroff study is looking at sort of magnetic and EEG recordings of brain activity while patients are performing a fairly well-known psychophysical test that has been used in the past to identify whether a patient has tinnitus. Very briefly, there are different sorts of animal studies that have shown that tinnitus may or may not kind of fill a gap of silence in an otherwise continuous sound. So just real quick, if you teach an animal how to be afraid of its own, how to be afraid of silence, and then you give it tinnitus and it turns out it's not afraid of silence anymore, that's how you know it's got tinnitus, right? Because it doesn't hear silence anymore. So they're going to have patients with tinnitus do that test, because humans can do it also, and then be measuring brain activity during that. So it's going to tell us, if nothing else, how well this test, this behavioral test has worked. But it's also going to give us some insight as to mechanistically what may be happening in those individuals. The next grant is one of the smaller grants, and this is the one that I mentioned earlier, where a Delphi study will be conducted of ongoing practitioners to determine what they feel would be most valuable for others in the medical profession to know about patients bothered by tinnitus when that patient first comes in. If we knew that a patient with bothersome tinnitus was always going to go to an audiologist first, our lives would be a lot easier in terms of clinical practice. Unfortunately, a lot of patients go to a chiropractor, they go to their primary care physician, they go to an herbalist, they go to any number of different professionals. And it's not always the case that those individuals, those professionals, know the most appropriate referral for that patient. There are a lot of things that need to be found out first. Jim Henry has done a lot of good work in this area with respect to veterans, And there are some other triage protocols, but this is one that we liked because it's going to be really directly questioning providers as to what they believe would help the patients the most in terms of onward referrals and routing them in the correct direction to other professionals. And then the last study is one we've also mentioned just a little bit, and this is the sleep study. And I believe you're going to be speaking to Dr. Guillard more in the future.
Yes, we're going to have a
Um,
whole separate conversation just with Dr. Guillard on
right.
his study. So he'll get pretty in depth on this, but maybe from your role as the SAC chair, you can talk briefly about why
Sure.
this one caught our eye.
Sure. And I'll tell you, we didn't get a grant from a physician in Brazil, Tanit Sanchez, but
Hmm.
she's actually doing some similar kind of work. So the idea is we all agree there's no simple cure for tinnitus. Okay, so how is it then that some people don't notice tinnitus after they take a nap? How is it then that sometimes when people wake up from a good night's sleep, they do not hear tinnitus? And how is it that sometimes they do hear tinnitus? What happened on those days when they didn't, or those nights, or those naps, where when they woke up, they didn't hear it anymore? So that's what this study is going to be looking at in terms of, again, brainwave activity during and following sleep. And
Interesting. Well, I'm really looking forward to the in-depth
well,
conversation with
what
him because it's
what's
such an
really
interesting area.
yeah, what's really cool about it is these are people who have their own cure for
Mm,
tinnitus in a way, right? And that's what Dr. Sanchez's work is also looking at. She's got at the TRI meeting in Vancouver, I think she reported on about 160 patients. I'm not sure how many she has now. But we know that for some people, tinnitus just remits spontaneously, just goes away for whatever reason, right? And so her logic is, why are we doing all this work trying to find a cure when some people actually already have it built into them? Why don't we try to learn more about these people and maybe something comes out of that? It's a really nice, it's a really kind of cool, very clean way to kind of look at stuff. And I think that Robin's work is doing this as well with respect to sleep.
yeah, I would agree. And the early conversations I've had with him have just been, I mean, for a non-scientist like myself, I'm a patient sufferer, patient leader here. Um, to know there are this many different areas that can be focused in on and could be considered a cure or a reasonable treatment
Yeah.
is just like to have more data behind it is such a great
Well,
thing for us to be able to focus on.
and what I really like about it is one thing that people really struck patients bothered by tinnitus really struggle with is there's no external cure. There's nothing that can be done out in the world, right?
Yeah.
And what if it turns out that a substantial proportion of patients actually have it in them already, actually already have something in them that we need to find that gives them relief?
And there's
And they
more
only
than
know,
a little bit of evidence pointing to the fact
right.
that
And
that's there.
they only notice it once in a while. It's not a
Yeah.
consistent thing. Well, okay, maybe it's our job to try to help figure that out. So I'm hoping that we see more of these kinds of investigations as
Well, that
time goes.
leads to my final question for you, which is we know the by the time this video posts, it'll be during Tinnitus Awareness Week. So it'll be February 2025 when people get access to this. We're going to keep this video online all year long. Um, but we are opening our submissions in February. So by the time this is posted, our submissions should be live. So folks can go to ata.org to find out more about how to submit their grant application. Do you have any tips or suggestions or pointers on folks who may want to go through the process of submitting?
Sure, sure. The whole idea of identifying subgroups is crucial. So anybody who is interested in a specific group of patients, musicians, for example, veterans, although the VA system kind of has its own mechanism, they're really backing away from funding tinnitus research as well. So anybody who's working with a group of patients that seems to have unique, unusual, perhaps employment related issues that the tinnitus is causing or is exacerbating, that would be great. Those would be great studies to look at. Again, not just because we learn more about the subgroup or the population, but we also can probably translate those findings pretty reasonably, right? So
Okay.
that'd be one area, the specific subgroups. And then we're also, personally, I believe sound and music and counseling, there's really nothing bad happens when you use those interventions. So personally speaking, the less invasive the intervention in some ways, perhaps for a large segment of the population, the more attractive it would be. So PIs, principal investigators who have done some work with different counseling strategies, different kinds of delivering interventions. That kind of stuff also, I think, is really important because, again, it's translatable. And again, different patient subgroups may show up, may kind of identify themselves under those circumstances. With respect to tinnitus, I think we've got a lot of good diagnostic tools, at least for use in the audiology clinic. The same is not true for sound tolerance disorders. And sound tolerance disorders very often accompany tinnitus. One thing I've learned working with veterans is that veterans with trauma exposures in their histories, they come into the tinnitus clinic with problems with their tinnitus, but when you talk to them, it turns out their bigger problem or problems have to do with tolerating routine sounds. And we don't have a lot of good instruments for evaluating that problem. We've got a few, some good ones, but we could always use more. So if anybody's interested also in trying to validate some kind of intake form, survey form for not just tinnitus, but sound intolerance problems,
Sure.
whether they're loudness related, pain related, specific annoying sounds, all of that I think would also be good. And then of course, you can't turn your back on the genetics work, and you cannot turn your back on these machine learning algorithms that are going to have the potential to illustrate associations in a very powerful way that currently we don't really have much information about. And I think we did a pretty good job of funding that kind of research, those kinds of studies on this last round.
Mm.
And I would like to see us, do that again. I don't want to invent the same wheel all over again, right? But I think there's enough diversity in the patient population of folks bothered by tinnitus that we can go for years and still be fleshing out differences between people and groups.
Yeah.
And then of course trying to tailor diagnostic and intervention strategies accordingly.
Well, as you said earlier, no shortage of need in areas of focus. So I want to thank you for your leadership, your thought leadership, your time. I mean, I've been involved with the ATA for 6 months now as the CEO, and I would consider you one of our most important stakeholders in terms of time donated, willingness to help out, whether it's thought leadership or time dedicated. You really have stepped up to the cause. So thank you for your dedication to the world of tinnitus, Mark.
I don't know how to respond.
Ju-
Aw, shucks.
Just please don't run. Please don't run. You've been wonderful, and I would be remiss if I didn't close out a short appeal to anyone who's made it this far into the video. You'll hear me say this ad nauseum. We cannot give what we do not have, and so if we had $20 million to fund research this year, we'd be funding $20 million in research, and
And
we would.
I'd be asking for more anyway, just so you know.
All right.
I'd still be asking for more because there's always going to be more to do.
Fantastic. Well, I'm here to try and make that happen along with everybody else. So thank you for being a part of that fight. And if you are so moved to consider a gift, ata.org. Again, not only just to apply for a grant, but if you want to maybe donate to a grant or donate to our research or just donate to our mission, it's very easy to do that. And we appreciate that. And thank you for being a part of Tinnitus Awareness Week this year, Mark. And I know I'll be talking to you real soon.
Thanks for everything, Patrick. We
All right.
appreciate you. Mhm.
Thank you.
Yep.
Please consider a donation today.